All right, let's jump right into it. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating and honestly highly provocative sociological text called The Boomer Legacy from Radical Neglect to Generational Theft. Now, whether you're a boomer, Gen X, a millennial, or really just someone who's curious about how modern families tick, this explainer is going to map out an argument that totally upends the standard story we hear about parenting. The source we're looking at makes a really bold claim that the baby boomer generation swung from completely ignoring their own kids to obsessively micromanaging their grandkids, and in doing so, basically rewired the American family structure. Now, my job today isn't to agree or disagree with the text, but to break down exactly what this author is arguing and clearly lay out their evidence. So here is our roadmap for the breakdown. We'll start with the generational family tree, move into the Gen X latchkey era, then hit the boomer redemption arc, millennial fallout, the institutional double squeeze, and finally wrap up with the cycle of dependency. Section 1. The generational family tree, defining the lineage. The author kicks things off with a massive question, one that pretty much anchors this entire analysis. How exactly did the whole self-actualization movement of the 1970s, the era of the me generation, alter the trajectory of the modern nuclear family? To answer that, the text says we actually have to correct a massive cultural blind spot first. Look, previous iterations of this kind of generational discourse completely acted as if Generation X just didn't exist. The media loves drawing this direct, skipping line of conflict between boomers and millennials, but the source emphasizes we absolutely cannot forget the basic biological reality here. Boomers are the parents of Generation X, and Generation X are the parents of millennials. Please, don't forget that. Which means, by definition, boomers are the grandparents of millennials. Remembering this exact specific sequence is absolutely crucial because the author's whole premise rests on how boomers behaved first as parents to Gen X and then later as grandparents to millennials. Section 2. Gen X, the Latchkey era. The author describes this dynamic as a giant generational pendulum swing. Back in the 1970s, as boomers were entering their peak parenting years, the whole culture shifted. It moved away from duty and community and heavily toward personal liberation and climbing the professional ladder. We saw divorce rates peak, and that led straight into the 1980s, creating the classic era of the Latch Key Kid. But then, as the text outlines, the pendulum swings wildly back in the other direction in the 2000s, right as those same boomers reach grandparenthood and suddenly become hyper-involved. So to really understand that 1980s phase, we need to look at this term the text uses, radical neglect. Now, the author is actually really careful to point out that this wasn't necessarily some deliberate, cruel parenting choice. Well, it was simply a byproduct. Boomers were just busy doing other things. They were pursuing self-actualization, trying to manage dual-income households, navigating divorces. They didn't intentionally let their kids roam free just to build character. According to the source, they often just literally weren't there to know where their kids were roaming in the first place. And this resulted in an intense adultification of Generation X. We're talking about kids returning to completely empty houses, navigating adult-level safety risks, and managing their own social conflicts entirely without a roadmap. The text paints this vivid picture of a whole generation essentially making their own dinners while the faces of missing children stared right back at them from the side of a milk carton. The silver lining here, at least as the author notes, is that this environment forged a generation with profound figure-it-out grit. They were physically free, psychologically hypervigilant, and fiercely, fiercely independent. Section 3. The Boomer Redemption Arc. Now we hit what the text calls a massive psychological 180, as boomers aged into grandparenthood. While their parenting style toward Gen X was defined by sheer absence, their grandparenting style toward millennials became defined by radical interference and constant surveillance. The author suggests this drastic flip was likely driven by subconscious guilt over their earlier absence, or maybe just a desperate search for a brand new validation project in their retirement years. And this dynamic culminates in a concept the author calls generational theft. The source argues that by over-inserting themselves, boomer grandparents effectively pulled up the ladder on Gen X. Think about it. Gen X wants to foster the exact same independence that made them so resilient, but boomer grandparents treat that very independence as neglect. So, by bypassing the actual Gen X parent to coddle the millennial grandchild, the boomer is essentially stealing the parent's rightful authority, all to engineer a psychological do-over for their own past mistakes. Section 4. Millennial Fallout and Gaslighting. This section of the text completely flips a massively popular cultural talking point on its head, the infamous participation trophy. The author explicitly states that millennials literally never asked for those trophies. They were manufactured by the older generations simply to soothe their own anxieties and curate this surface-level appearance of achievement. The text argues quite bluntly that millennials were just treated as a legacy project. But the author goes even further here, detailing what they call economic gaslighting. The argument is that while millennials were being performatively overparented at home, they were simultaneously being economically abandoned out in the real world. The source claims that boomers actively dismantled the social safety nets that were built by the silent generation. They oversaw skyrocketing tuition, impossible housing costs, and yet they still preach this pull yourself up by your bootstraps philosophy. To mock millennials is soft because of the very participation trophies the boomers handed them, well, the author argues that is an absolute masterpiece of psychological projection. The entire emotional core of the text's argument really boils down to this. Millennials are struggling to launch, not because they somehow lack skills or drive, but because they were treated as accessories for boomer redemption. They were constantly told they were the center of the universe, but then explicitly denied the actual autonomy and the economic stability required to navigate that universe. Section 5. The institutional double squeeze. Taking a step back, the text argues that this boomer impact extends way beyond the family, deep into our societal institutions. Their prime earning era was characterized by incredibly high consumption, prioritizing tax cuts and locking down protected entitlements for their own retirement. And the societal impact of that? Really low investment for the future, effectively dismantling the ladder of middle-class expansion right behind them. The text argues they consumed the stability of the family in the 70s for their own freedom, and now they're consuming the autonomy of the modern family for their own validation. And because of those massive institutional choices, Gen X and older millennials are now totally trapped in what the text calls the double squeeze. They are getting squeezed from the bottom by the intense, crushing cost and insecurity of trying to raise children today. And simultaneously, they're squeezed from the top by aging boomer parents who, according to the text, expect a level of devotion, presence, and care that they themselves historically withheld from their own kids back during the Latchkey era. Section 6. A cycle of dependency. All of this builds to the author's ultimate, really sobering conclusion. The source claims that by refusing to step back and just allow natural familial independence to take hold, boomers have fundamentally transformed the American family. It is no longer a launchpad to propel the next generation forward. Instead, it's become a theater for ongoing psychodrama. The me generation, the text concludes, started out by leaving their kids alone so they could find themselves, and now they're finishing up by refusing to leave their grandkids alone so they can do the exact same thing. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question based on the text's analysis. If this cycle of dependency and interference really is the legacy we are living with today, how on earth do we break it? How do Gen X and millennials reclaim their authority and restore a natural, healthy sense of independence back into the family unit? It's a wildly complex and challenging argument from our source today, and it for sure leaves us with a ton to think about regarding how generations inevitably shape one another. Thank you so much for learning with us today on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep digging into the source material, and we will see you next time.